On the morning of October the 19th, 1973, 16 men were found dead across 3 separate logging sites in the Douglas fir country outside Timber Falls, Oregon. The deaths occurred over a span of 11 hours on the night of October the 18th. The perpetrators were 4 members of the Blackwood family, ranging in age from 47 to 68 years old. The motive, as determined by investigators and later confirmed in court, centered on a single Douglas fir tree marked with the initials of Samuel Blackwood, a tree the family considered sacred ground, cut down by a contract logging crew working for Cascade Timber Corporation. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. Timber Falls sat in a narrow valley where the rain came sideways most months of the year, and the timber industry had been dying slowly since the end of the Second World War. By the early 1970s, the big mills had consolidated or closed entirely, leaving behind rust-stained buildings with broken windows and populations that had shrunk by half. What remained were small operations, independent loggers working marginal contracts, men who drove trucks older than their sons and lived in houses heated by wood they cut themselves. The air smelled like diesel and wet bark and chainsaw exhaust. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open ones. The diner served coffee in chipped mugs, and the hardware store extended credit it knew would never be fully repaid. This was a place where men measured their worth in cords of wood and hours worked, where a handshake still meant something, and where grudges could be held across generations because there was nothing else left to hold on to. Samuel Blackwood was 68 years old in the autumn of 1973. He had worked timber since he was 14, first with cross-cut saws and axes, later with chainsaws that left his hands numb and his hearing permanently damaged. He stood just under 6 feet tall with shoulders that had begun to curve forward from decades of heavy labor. His face was weathered dark, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, and his hands were gnarled and scarred, the knuckles swollen from arthritis that he never mentioned and never treated. He wore wool flannel shirts even in summer, denim work pants held up with suspenders, and boots he resoled himself in his workshop every winter. He drank his coffee black and hot enough to burn, ate his meals in silence, and spoke only when he had something worth saying. He had been married once to a woman named Eleanor, who had died of cancer in 1961, and since then he had lived alone in the house his grandfather had built in 1892, a 2-story structure of hand-hewn timber that sat on 80 acres of forest land at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud when the rains came hard. Samuel had 3 sons. The oldest was Joseph, 47 years old, a man built like his father but quieter, more withdrawn, who had lost his left hand to a sawmill accident in 1964 and now worked as a timber cruiser, walking the forests to estimate board feet for logging operations. The middle son was Daniel, 43, who ran a small independent logging crew with 2 employees and equipment held together with wire and prayer. The youngest was Thomas, 39, who worked as a mechanic in town and drank too much on weekends but showed up when family called. All 3 men lived within 10 miles of their father. All 3 carried the same sense of duty and pride that Samuel had carried, the understanding that a man's word was his bond, and that respect once lost could never be fully recovered. The tree that would change everything stood on the western edge of Samuel's property, close to the boundary line with land that had once belonged to another logging family but had been sold to Cascade Timber Corporation in 1968. It was a Douglas fir, old growth, with a trunk diameter of nearly 6 feet and a height that reached 200 feet into the Oregon sky. Samuel's grandfather had marked that tree in 1895, carving his initials into the bark with a hand chisel 3 feet up from the ground where the bark was thick and the wood was hard. The initials were S. Beese, for Samuel Blackwood, the same name carried by the grandfather and passed down to the grandson. The old man had marked the tree not to claim ownership in any legal sense, but to mark a moment, a decision. He had been clearing land to build the house and had come to that tree and decided it would stand. It would be the landmark, the witness, the constant. Everything else could be cut and used and sold, but that tree would remain. He told his son this, and his son told Samuel, and Samuel had walked to that tree more times than he could count, placing his hand on the bark where the initials had been carved, feeling the ridges and grooves that had grown over with new wood but never disappeared entirely. In September of 1973, Cascade Timber Corporation began a logging operation on the land adjacent to Samuel's property. The boundary had been surveyed years earlier, marked with metal stakes and flagging tape, but boundaries in timber country were sometimes approximate, especially in dense forest, where sight lines were limited and landmarks could shift. Samuel had spoken with the logging foreman, a man named Vincent Driscoll, when the operation began. He had asked Driscoll to be mindful of the boundary, to mark the corner where his property met the corporation land, and specifically to stay clear of the old Douglas fir with the carved initials. Driscoll had nodded and said he understood, said his crew would be careful, but Driscoll was working on a tight contract with penalties for delays and bonuses for early completion, and his attention was on volume and speed, not on the sentimental concerns of an old man with a marked tree. On the morning of October the 1st, Samuel walked his property line as he did every few weeks. The rain had stopped temporarily, and the forest was quiet except for the sound of chainsaws in the distance. When he reached the western edge, he found the Douglas fir lying on the ground. The trunk had been cut cleanly, the stump showed fresh sawdust, and the tree had been bucked into sections and hauled away, leaving only the stump with the carved initials still visible, 3 feet tall and now exposed to the open air where the forest canopy had been. Samuel stood looking at the stump for a long time. He did not shout or curse. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, feeling something inside him go cold and hard. He drove into the logging site and found Vincent Driscoll standing beside a yarder, shouting instructions to a crew loading logs onto a truck. Samuel approached and waited until Driscoll noticed him. He said the tree had been cut. Driscoll looked confused, then annoyed, then defensive. He said the tree had been on corporation land according to the survey, said his crew had followed the markers, said mistakes happen in boundary work, and there was nothing to be done about it now. Samuel said the tree had been marked, said his grandfather had carved those initials more than 70 years ago, said he had asked Driscoll personally to protect it. Driscoll said he had a contract to fulfill and a schedule to keep, said he was sorry if the old man was upset, but timber was timber and business was business. He turned away before Samuel could respond, shouting at his crew to hurry up. The daylight was burning. Samuel drove into town and went to the county assessor's office. He requested a copy of the survey map and the property records. The clerk, a young woman who had grown up in Timber Falls and knew the Blackwood name, pulled the files and spread them on the counter. The boundary line, as drawn on the map, ran within 15 feet of where the Douglas fir had stood. The tree had been close to the line, possibly on it, possibly just over it. The survey had been done in 1967, using measurements from older surveys dating back to the 1800s, and the margin of error was acknowledged in the paperwork. Samuel asked what recourse he had. The clerk said he could file a complaint with the county, or hire a surveyor to re-establish the boundary, or consult a lawyer. But all of that would take time and money, and the tree was already gone. Samuel thanked her and left. He went to see a lawyer in the county seat, a man named Gerald Haverford, who had handled property disputes before. Haverford listened to the story, reviewed the documents Samuel had brought, and explained that proving the tree had been on Blackwood land would be difficult and expensive. Even if the boundary could be re-established in Samuel's favor, the damages would be limited to the timber value of a single tree, perhaps a few $100s, minus legal fees that would run into the thousands. Haverford was gentle in his explanation, but clear in his conclusion. The law, he said, was not designed to protect sentiment. Samuel thanked him and drove home. That evening, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread in front of him. The house was cold, and he had not bothered to light the stove. He stared at the survey map, at the thin line that separated his land from the corporation land, at the notation in the margin about measurement error. He thought about his grandfather carving those initials, about the decision to let the tree stand, about the quiet pride the old man had taken in that choice. He thought about Vincent Driscoll turning away, dismissing him, reducing 70 years of family history to timber and business. He thought about the law, which offered him nothing, and about the stump sitting in the open air exposed and violated. The following Sunday, Samuel's 3 sons came to the house for dinner, as they did most weeks. They sat around the same table where they had eaten as boys, the same table their grandfather had built. Samuel served venison stew and bread and coffee, and after the meal was finished and the dishes were cleared, he told them about the tree. He spoke without emotion, laying out the facts in order. The tree had been cut. Driscoll had dismissed his concerns. The law offered no real remedy. The stump remained as evidence of the disrespect. His sons listened in silence. Joseph, the oldest, asked what their father intended to do. Samuel said he did not know yet, but he would not let the matter rest. Daniel said the corporation would not care about one tree, said men like Driscoll operated with impunity because they had money and contracts and lawyers. Thomas said nothing, but his jaw was tight and his hands were clenched on the table. Joseph finally spoke. He said their grandfather had marked that tree as a promise, a statement that some things were more important than profit. He said their father had kept that promise for 68 years, walking to that tree, maintaining the memory, teaching his sons what it meant. He said Vincent Driscoll had not just cut down a tree. He had cut down the idea that a man's word and a man's history mattered. Daniel agreed. He said they could not let this stand, could not let men like Driscoll believe they could do as they pleased without consequence. Thomas said if they acted, there would be a price to pay. Samuel said he understood the price, said he had thought of nothing else for days, said he was old and had lived his life, and if this was the final stand he made, then so be it. His sons looked at each other, then back at their father. They nodded. They spent the next 2 weeks planning, not with violence in mind initially, but with the intention of confronting Driscoll and his crew in a way that could not be ignored. They would go to the logging site at night, when the crew was camped there, and they would demand an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a public admission that the tree had been taken improperly. If Driscoll refused, they would destroy equipment, burn the logs already cut, make the operation too costly to continue. It was an act of sabotage, yes, but it was also an act of justice in their eyes, a restoration of balance. They did not discuss what would happen if Driscoll and his crew resisted. They did not discuss the possibility of violence. They simply prepared, gathering tools and gasoline, mapping the site, watching the routines of the logging crew. On the evening of October the 18th, the 4 Blackwood men drove in 2 trucks to the logging site. The time was shortly after 8 o'clock in the evening. The sky was dark and overcast, the air cold and damp, the kind of night where sound carried far and visibility was poor. The logging crew had set up a camp at the site, as they often did during intensive operations, sleeping in trailers and tents rather than driving back to town each night. There were 16 men in total, a mix of fallers, choker setters, equipment operators, and laborers, all working for Driscoll under contract to Cascade Timber. The camp was quiet when the Blackwoods arrived, most of the men finishing dinner or preparing for sleep, a few sitting around a fire drinking coffee or something stronger. Samuel parked his truck at the edge of the site and stepped out. His sons followed. They carried no guns, only tools, wrenches and axes and cans of gasoline. Samuel walked toward the fire where several men were sitting. He recognized Driscoll among them. He stopped at the edge of the firelight and said he needed to speak with Driscoll. The men around the fire looked up, surprised, wary. Driscoll stood slowly, his expression annoyed. He asked what Samuel wanted. Samuel said he wanted an admission that the tree had been wrongly cut, that Driscoll had ignored his request, that the boundary had been violated. Driscoll laughed, a short, harsh sound. He said the old man needed to let it go, said he was trespassing on an active work site, said if Samuel did not leave he would call the sheriff. Samuel did not move. He said his grandfather had marked that tree in 1895, said it had stood for 78 years, said Driscoll had destroyed something that could not be replaced. Driscoll said it was just a goddamn tree, said the corporation owned the land and the timber and had every right to harvest it. He turned to the other men and made a joke, something about old men and their fantasies, and the men laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort, the way men laugh when they do not know what else to do. That laughter was the breaking point. Joseph stepped forward and struck Driscoll across the face with the back of his remaining hand. Driscoll staggered, blood appearing at his lip. The other men stood quickly, reaching for tools, makeshift weapons, whatever was close. Daniel and Thomas moved to flank their father. Samuel said nothing, but his face was set, and in that moment, every man there understood that something irrevocable had begun. What followed was not a fight in any organized sense, but a brutal, chaotic collision of men who had spent their lives working with their hands and their strength. The logging crew outnumbered the Blackwoods 4-1, but the Blackwoods had the advantage of conviction, of desperation, of men who had already accepted the cost of their actions. The fight spread across the camp, from the fire to the equipment yard to the trailers. Men grappled and struck and fell. Tools became weapons, an axe handle, a length of chain, a pry bar. The darkness made it worse, made it impossible to see clearly, to distinguish friend from enemy. The rain began to fall, cold and steady, turning the ground to mud. Samuel found himself grappling with a young man, perhaps 25 years old, a faller with a strong grip and quick reflexes. They struggled near the yarder, slipping in the mud, breathing hard. Samuel felt his age, felt his strength failing, but he did not let go. The young man broke free and grabbed a wrench from the ground, swinging it wildly. Samuel moved instinctively, deflecting the blow, and in the struggle the young man fell backward, his head striking the metal frame of the yarder with a sound that was dull and final. Samuel stood over him, breathing hard, and realized the young man was not moving. Joseph fought two men near the trucks, using his experience and his weight to keep them off balance. One man came at him with a cant hook, the sharp tip aimed at Joseph's chest. Joseph sidestepped and drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, sending him backward into the side of a truck. The man's head snapped back against the mirror mount, and he crumpled. The second man hesitated, then ran into the darkness. Joseph did not pursue. Daniel found himself surrounded by three men near the log deck. They were shouting at him, calling him crazy, demanding he leave. Daniel held an axe handle in both hands, moving it in short arcs to keep them at distance. One man rushed him, and Daniel swung, connecting with the man's shoulder, hearing bone crack. The man screamed and fell. The other two attacked together, one high and one low, and Daniel went down under their weight. They beat him with their fists and boots, and Daniel felt ribs crack, felt blood in his mouth. He managed to roll free, grabbing the axe handle again, swinging blindly. He connected with something soft, then something hard. The men stopped moving. Thomas fought with a rage that had been building for years, not just over the tree, but over everything. The decline of the town, the loss of dignity, the sense that men like him no longer mattered. He swung a length of chain, striking anything that moved, not caring who or what. Men fell around him. He did not count them. He did not think. He simply fought until there was no one left standing near him. And then he stood in the rain, breathing hard, the chain hanging from his hand. By the time the fight ended, it was nearly midnight. The rain fell steadily, washing blood into the mud. The four Blackwood men gathered near Samuel's truck, checking each other for injuries. Daniel's ribs were broken, Thomas had a deep gash across his forehead, Joseph's knuckles were split and bleeding, and Samuel moved slowly, favoring his left side. They walked through the camp, checking the men on the ground. Some were breathing, unconscious but alive. Others were not breathing. They counted 16 men total, all down, some beyond help. Samuel stood in the rain, looking at what they had done, and felt nothing but emptiness. They drove back to Samuel's house in silence. The time was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when they arrived. They cleaned their hands at the kitchen sink, the water running red, and then they sat at the table and waited. There was no discussion of running or hiding. They had known from the beginning what the consequences would be. Samuel made coffee, and they drank it slowly, listening to the rain on the roof. At 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 sheriff's vehicles arrived. The deputies approached the house cautiously, hands on their weapons. Samuel opened the door before they knocked. He said they had been expecting them. The deputies asked if anyone was hurt, and Samuel said no, they were fine. The deputies asked if the Blackwood men would come peacefully, and Samuel said yes. They were arrested without incident, handcuffed and placed in the back of the vehicles and driven into town as the sun began to rise through the clouds. The trial took place in the county courthouse in March of 1974. The prosecution presented evidence methodically, witnesses who had survived the attack, medical examiners who detailed the causes of death, forensic reports that placed the Blackwood men at the scene. The defense attorney, appointed by the court, argued that the confrontation had begun as a peaceful attempt to address a legitimate grievance and had escalated into violence only when the logging crew became aggressive. The argument was weak, and everyone knew it. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Samuel Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joseph received 30 years, Daniel received 25 years, Thomas received 20 years. The judge, a man who had lived in the county for 40 years and had known Samuel Blackwood by reputation, said before pronouncing sentence that he understood the cultural context, understood the weight of tradition and honor in timber country, but that the law could not excuse the taking of 16 lives over a tree, marked or not. Samuel Blackwood died in the Oregon State Penitentiary in 1982 at the age of 77. He never expressed remorse, never appealed his sentence, and never spoke about the night of October the 18th, except to say that his grandfather's promise had been honored. Joseph was released in 2003, after serving 29 years. He returned to Timber Falls and lived alone in a small apartment above the hardware store until his death in 2011. Daniel was released in 1998 and moved to Eastern Oregon, where he worked on a cattle ranch until he could no longer work. He died in 2016. Thomas was released in 1993 and struggled with alcoholism and depression, eventually taking his own life in 2001. None of the men married after their release. None of them spoke publicly about what had happened. The families of the 16 loggers who died received settlements from the State Victim Compensation Fund, though no amount of money could restore what had been lost. The logging site where the confrontation occurred was abandoned shortly after the trial. Cascade Timber Corporation dissolved its operations in the area within 2 years, unable to recover from the scandal and the lawsuits. The land reverted to the county for unpaid taxes and was eventually purchased by a conservation trust in the early 2000s. It is now part of a protected forest preserve, closed to logging, open only to hikers and researchers. The old growth timber still stands, what remains of it, and the forest has begun to reclaim the scars left by the logging roads and equipment yards. The stump of the Douglas fir marked by Samuel Blackwood's grandfather can still be found if you know where to look. The initials SB still visible, carved deep into wood that refuses to rot. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate what happened there or why. The people of Timber Falls do not talk about the Blackwood family or the events of 1973. The story has become a kind of ghost, something everyone knows but no one discusses, passed down in whispers and half-remembered fragments. On quiet days when the rain falls sideways through the Douglas firs and the forest is empty of sound, you can walk to the place where the camp once stood and find nothing but moss and ferns, and the slow, patient growth of trees reclaiming land that was briefly torn open by human ambition and human pride. The Blackwood house still stands at the end of the gravel road. Though it is vacant now, the windows boarded, the roof sagging. No one has lived there since Samuel was taken away, and no one wants to. The place carries a weight, a sense of something unfinished, something that can never be made right. The 80 acres of forest that once belonged to the family have been absorbed into the Conservation Trust, protected now by law from the very industry that built the family's identity and ultimately destroyed it. Sometimes the monsters we fear are not born, they are made. One broken promise at a time.